investigación, que ustedes saben, en lo general se destinan muy pocos recursos y cada vez menos para hacer investigación, de tal forma que es primordial que nos pongamos de acuerdo las organizaciones sindicales del mundo para buscar las mejores estrategias que permitan avanzar en ese tener mayores recursos para la educación media superior y superior y para la investigación. Yo quiero darle la bienvenida y los saludo como un recién llegado a nuestro país, a México. No había venido antes a México. Julian L. Garritzman, él es doctor en Ciencias Políticas por la Universidad de Goethe Frankfurt, politólogo, especializado en política comparada, investigador en educación y política social global, política partidista y política pública, profesor de Ciencias Políticas en el Instituto de Ciencias Políticas de la Universidad Goethe de Frankfurt, investigador senior en la Universidad de Zúrich, becario Max Weber en el Instituto Universitario Europeo en Florencia, profesor titular sustituto en la Universidad de Constanz, investigador postdoctoral, Departamento de Política y Administración Pública en la Universidad de Constanz. Actualmente el doctor Julián L. Garritzman trabaja en la intersección de comparativa economía política, políticas públicas y sociología política. La mayor parte de su trabajo se centra en el estado de bienestar. Su más reciente investigación es sobre administración, tratando de comprender el papel de los ministerios, las burocracias, los tecnócratas y expertos en política. Habremos de acotar un poco esta conferencia por ese amplio discurso del señor presidente que les habló sobre hechos históricos de nuestro país y por tanto la hora del almuerzo es la 1 ahorita, 1:05. ¿A qué hora es el almuerzo? Entonces a las 2, sí. Habremos de concluir la conferencia y las preguntas, si llegamos a ellas, a las 2 de la tarde para a esa hora tener el almuerzo. Y bueno, pues no, pues es la 1. Entonces le cedemos el uso de la palabra a Julian y pues vamos a enriquecernos con las aportaciones que tenga para nosotros en su disertación. Gracias, Julian.
Thank you very much. Should I use this microphone? For me, it's fine. So thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and more generally for the invitation. It's a big honor to speak after the president and after you sang the national anthem to speak on the stage. And my task here is to present you an overview on how money matters in higher education, in research, in further education. And I think many of you are anyways already convinced of this, so I'm not going to try to convince you, but to show you the
los voy a tratar de convencer. Y por el lado de las presentaciones que ven en la pared, van a ver mucha información. No traten de ver cada una, únicamente voy a hablar de los patrones principales que serán los más importantes para ustedes. La pregunta, ¿por qué nos debe importar el financiamiento? Y muchos de ustedes ya lo hacen, pero es necesario que yo les diga cómo cómo fondeamos, cómo financiamos la educación en general. Son consecuencias sumamente importantes. Afecta la calidad de educación, cómo crecen los países, los patrones de crecimiento económico, los patrones de empleo, quién tiene trabajo, qué tipo de trabajos, etcétera. Para darles uno o dos ejemplos, como el presidente hablaba de la ayuda a los estudiantes, todo esto importa muchísimo para la calidad de educación. Cuando tenemos una ayuda generosa en la forma de becas que no se tiene que pagar, pues las familias finalmente estudian educación superior, se pueden graduar y seguir con sus estudios. Entonces, realmente esto es sumamente importante. Y el efecto contrario es para todas las colegiaturas en escuelas privadas. Por ejemplo, los estudiantes que no tienen altos ingresos, que quizá no puedan estudiar y también toman como programas menos prestigiosos. Entonces, esta ayuda, pues, y las cuotas de colegiatura afectan las desigualdades.
Because when you pay a lot for your own education, you also expect that you get a higher return on the labor market, and therefore you have a wage premium and then a larger wage inequality. That's one example. There are many more. So, for example, we know that how you fund research and development affects what type of research you get. So, more public research and development funding is related to having more researchers, and that again is related to having more research output, however measured. These are but two examples. We could look at many, many more. I would still say that money is only one dimension of politics, and you all are aware of this, but I think it's a very important one, and I think politically it's a very important one because it's easy to communicate. It's easy to go to the president and to say, we want spending to be at 1% of the GDP. That's easier to say than lots of governance reforms. So I think it's a very important target that you are trying to set at this conference. So let me turn to empirics and show you some of the patterns. I first focus on higher education and basically the total amounts that countries are spending. This slide is way too small for you to read, but that's not the idea. So the idea is, this is showing you information for 123 countries, lots of countries. And we see that the mean value that countries spend is 0.83% of their GDP. I think it's hard to tell whether this is a lot or a little because we don't have any absolute measure. But of course, you can compare it to something like a NATO saying we need to spend 2% of our budget on defense. But you see that there's also a lot of variation around this mean. So some countries hardly spend anything on higher education, and others even spend 2%, 3% of their wealth on higher education. So there are massive differences. And when you look closer, it's mostly the countries of Europe, especially Nordic Europe, that are the high spenders, together with North America and some parts of Latin America. And on the other hand, we find most African countries, not all, but most of them, as well as many Southeast Asian countries. So to some degree, this is related to wealth, but this is showing you the number as a share of GDP. On this next slide, I'm showing you the same information, but over time. So you see how much it has changed from 2006 to 2018. And these are the total amounts corrected for power purchasing parity, so kind of how valuable your money is. And what we see is that over these 10 years, the amounts in the world have doubled. So we're spending now twice the amounts that we used to spend. We basically see an increase in every world region. It's still the case that Europe and North America are delivering the largest share, but their relative size kind of has decreased. So they used to spend 60% of this entire budget, and nowadays spend about 49%. And most of the catching up appears in Eastern and Southeast Asian countries. So here we see that they used to be like 70% of the spending, and nowadays are around 25%. So especially Asia is catching up. Now the slides are not jumping anymore. I don't know if someone could assist. Because what the next slide is going to show you is, yes, this one, when we set these amounts in relation to how many students we have. The picture looks a bit different, because at the same time of spending going up, we also see that enrollment is going up. We have more and more students who are studying. And when we correct for this, we see that it is especially countries that already did spend a lot of money that are now spending even more. So kind of the per student amounts are going up, especially in Europe and in North America, and not so much in Asia, where we saw this big increase in total amounts. So the other way around, and I hope I'm not too fast for the interpreters with all the technical details. We see a big increase in Asia, but that's mostly driven by enrollment going up. In some countries, especially in Latin America, we even see a decrease in the total amount spent per student. On this next slide, I'm focusing on the most recent changes between 2019 and 2020, because I was asked to comment on how COVID, the pandemic, has affected spending. And what you see here is quite big changes in some of the countries. So on average, spending went down between 2019 and 2020, slightly so, but it went slightly down. But we see some big exceptions. So in some countries, it increased by almost 20%. In others, it decreased by almost 20%. But my point with this slide would be very careful in interpreting this data, because it distracts from the fact that there were other trends before this year. So for example, Canada shows here up as one of the countries that is increasing its spending. But in many years before, Canada was actually decreasing its spending, which you can't see on this slide. And on the other side, we see, for example, that the Czech Republic has decreased its spending. But before 2019, the Czech Republic was actually increasing its money a lot. So my takeaway here would be careful only to look at these very recent changes. That's why on the next slide, I'm showing you long-term patterns between 1970 and 2020. So this is really the longest data we have. And I show you this not for all of the countries in the world, because then it's not readable anymore. I focus here on 16 countries that maybe can serve as representatives of the regions. So for example, there's Argentina, Brazil, Canada, China. So they stand for different parts of the world. And my main takeaway from this slide would be that spending is slightly increasing over time, but it does so super slowly and only very gradually. So don't expect, looking into the future, that there will be a massive change in higher education spending. From what we see in the past, it's very slowly emerging. And in some countries like Canada, the trends are even going down. This is a pattern that we call in political science path dependence. So countries are dependent on what they did in their past before. So far, I focused on public spending. And the opposite side, of course, is private spending. And I'm trying to show you this here on this slide. So you see kind of what share of all the money that is in higher education comes from public sources and what share comes from private sources. That's mostly tuition fees, but it's also money spent from companies. And what you see in these black bars is that in most of the countries, money comes from the government. So in many countries, the public is the main investor in higher education. But we have a couple of countries where private spending is also very important. That's especially the Anglo-Saxon countries, the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, also some Northeast Asian countries, Japan and Korea, and some of the Latin American countries. The president this morning mentioned Chile, which I think everyone knows has this strong legacy of neoliberalism that really privatized education to a high degree. So there is variation, but most of the countries actually focus on public spending. So far, I focused on total amounts. And what I try to do on the next slides is to look more closely at what this money is spent on exactly. And I'm kind of warning you with this picture from Alice in the Wonderland, where she's going into the rabbit hole. Because it can get super technical, and I don't want you to get afraid of the findings or slides. And to show you a bit how this variation looks like, I made this scheme which just shows you that we can spend money in many, many different ways. So, for example, we can spend money on buildings, or on staff, on teaching staff, on non-teaching staff. We can spend it on financial student aid. We can spend it on tax deductions to parents. And all of those have very different dynamics. So, for example, spending money on grants reduces inequality, and spending money on tax deductions can increase inequality. So it really depends how you spend this money. I'm not going in all of this detail, but want to show you some of it. So on this slide, I'm focusing on how much countries are spending on financial student aid in general. And this is information I took from some other source, so this is distinguishing between the global north and the global south. I don't know if you agree to the labels, but let's stick with that for a moment. Then we see that spending in the global north countries on financial student aid is much higher than in the global south. And that's not a coincidence, but for good reasons. We can then also combine this information of what I showed you on the tuition fees and student grants into what I call the 4 worlds of student finance. So on this axis going up, you have how much students on average are paying. And it might be 0, that students don't pay any tuition fees, but it might also be in countries like the United States or others that you have very high tuition fees. And on this other axis, the x-axis, you have how many students receive some form of financial student aid. And I like to distinguish there these 4 groups, that some countries don't charge tuition, but they also don't support students financially. For example, Germany and other countries in the middle of Europe. We then have Nordic Europe in the bottom right, where you also don't have tuition fees, but you have lots of financial student aid, so they are trying to bring many students to college. We then have countries in the top right, like England or the United States, where you have very high tuition fees, but it's also rather easy to get money. Mostly in the forms of loans, subsidized loans, but some aid is available. And we also have this 4th cluster that I think we often forget about, of very high tuition and very low financial student aid. Chile, Japan, Korea would be cases here. And all of these, of course, have massive effects on educational inequality and how students are doing. We can also look at how much money is actually spent on people. So teachers in higher education versus other stuff. And these black bars are here kind of money that goes not to people, but to other things, buildings and so on, investments in infrastructure. And the gray bars show you how much money is invested in people. And what you see, I mark here kind of the 50% line, is that actually most of the spending goes to staff. So most of the money goes to people, which I guess is a good sign. But the mean in all of the countries is 67%. So there's lots of money that is not going to people, but rather to investment. And just compare it to the mean in non-higher education. So for example, in schools, there you have a mean of 78%. So what this means is that in schools, we spend more money on staff, and in higher education, still a lot of money on staff, but also other investments like physical infrastructure. There's also a lot of variation in what the money on staff is spent on. I'm highlighting here the cases of Luxembourg and Austria. So in Luxembourg, most of the money goes to non-teaching staff. And in Austria, most of the money goes to teaching staff. So there's also lots of variation there. There are also big differences on how money is allocated. So how do you actually get money as a higher education institution? And a particularly hot topic at the moment is so-called performance-based funding. So there's a big normative discussion also on whether it's good to give money based on performance or not. And of course, you can do performance-based funding or other sources. So you can just give higher education institutions so-called block grants. So they get the money and can do it whatever they like. Or you give it to them with a particular purpose, so-called line item budgets or project-based funding. So now we are in the details, but I want you only to focus on the empirical patterns. So empirically, we don't have a lot of information. So I only have this for some countries, some comparable data. And we see that there are very big differences. So for example, in Denmark and Finland, about 85%, 76% of the money is based on performance criteria. So this can be students graduating, or it can be students graduating with certain grades, or it can be how well students end up on the labor market or something. And in other countries, for example, Poland, this is much lower, around 15%. There's also a big range of criteria that are applied. Sometimes it's entirely focused on quantitative measures, so metrics. And sometimes we have qualitative measures that, for example, scientists write reports on how well the university system is doing. Some of you might wonder, so is this now good or bad? So does performance-based funding actually work? I would say we don't really know yet. I think we need more research on this, but we have some meta-analyses. They are basically statistical literature reviews. And these meta-analyses show performance-based funding basically has no effect on study completion rates. So it doesn't help, but it also doesn't hurt. But performance-based funding can have some so-called unintended consequences. So for example, higher education institutions are more likely to accept students that are more likely to graduate. Again, increasing educational inequality. There's also some work showing that researchers become more risk-averse and focus on kind of smaller projects where they are more sure that something gets published. So my conclusion would be, at least as far as we know right now, it really depends. I think you can't say performance-based funding is good or it's bad. I think it really depends on the details of how you design the performance-based system. Let me also say a few words on research and development, because I know that some of you are very interested in this, so how this is funded. I'm again first showing you how much money is spent on research and development as a share of how rich countries are. And what you see there are very big differences. So here the mean is that about 2% of the GDP is going to research and development. So that's actually much more than to higher education in general. But most of this money comes from the private sector. So if we take the private sector out, it's only 0.56% that comes from public sources. But as you see, there's a lot of variation. You can even see it clearer, I hope, on the next slide. So this is showing you how this has changed from 1980 until today. And let me highlight some countries. So in Japan and Korea, we see a massive increase in private research and development funding. The public money is basically stable, but the private one is really kicking off. We see the same, not to the same degree, but an increase in Denmark, in Germany, in Sweden, and in Switzerland. So kind of Nordic Europe and continental Europe, where more and more money is spent on research and development. We also see it to some degree in the United States and the United Kingdom, but especially in the United States, the public money is trending down. So there's more and more competition for public research and development funding. We also see it in Israel, and there it's often also related to military expenses. And most recently, we also see it in China as a country that is trying to catch up. As I was introduced as a political scientist, I was also asked to talk a bit about what explains all this variation. So why do some countries spend more than others? And I don't know if you are interested in this, so I'll just focus on the main message. That is, we know, not from my opinion, but from very strong empirical work, that 3 groups of explanations are important. So one group of explanations are socioeconomic factors, for example, demographics, or how rich your country is. The second group is political actors, so what kind of parties you have, what kind of trade unions you have. And then third, we know that institutions matter. And I could talk about this for 2 hours, but I won't. Let me just highlight under what conditions we know that public funding is likely to increase. So this is more likely to happen if you have a strong economy, also a growing economy. Vice versa, the worst that can happen is fiscal austerity. If you have fiscal austerity, education is one of the first areas that will be cut. Second, it helps if you have a young population. If you are an aging society like Germany or like Japan, a lot of the money goes to pensions, crowding out public budgets. And we also know that older people on average rather tend to vote for right parties. So that's a second mechanism that tends to shift money towards pensions rather than to education. We also know that it helps if you don't have too much debt, which of course is really hard to affect, but countries that have large amounts of debts or large deficits find it really hard to expand spending on education. We also know that it matters a lot whether a country has a labor market that focuses on skills. So the more your labor market, so what you're trying to produce in a country focuses on skills, the more likely it is that you focus on investments as well. When we look at political actors, we know by now that left-wing parties help, and not only on the national level, but also on the subnational level, especially when these subnational levels are important for education. We also know that trade unions can matter, especially when they are inclusive. So when you have in a country 20 trade unions that fight each other, that's not going to help you. But if you have one or two big ones that cooperate, this is much more likely to have an effect. And finally, it helps if you don't have a legacy of very high private investment. So the other way around, if you already have very high tuition fees, you are likely to continue on that path, and it's very difficult to get away from there. It's very difficult to switch to a public higher education system. So let me conclude, and I'm not trying to summarize all of this information because I think it is way too much for everyone to remember. So let me just say that I think money is very important in higher education, in further education, in research and development, and in every other area. It's on the one hand a very easy indicator. We can say we want to spend 1.5% of GDP on higher education. And on the other hand, it's a super complex issue because it's all about these technical details, how you fund something. In terms of data, as you saw on my slides, we have much better information for the rich, high-income OECD countries. For the rest of the world, the data is much broader. So often it's difficult to distinguish between different kinds of higher education funding. So if you have the means to affect your government, I would very much urge that you try that they collect good data. We do see a global trend towards more spending and towards more enrollment. So that's maybe the good sign. But we also see, as I showed you, a couple of countries that very much focus on private spending and are very much likely to continue in this direction. And my last point here on the slides is that spending is very, very hard to change. So kind of speaking politically, it's great, I think, if you as organizations are very ambitious, but the data tells us it's very hard to change. So don't get frustrated. I think change is possible, but it's very likely to be gradual change in the kind of digits. All right, I'll stop there and very much look forward to questions, comments.
Gracias, Julian. Creo que lo que aquí nos ha mostrado con base en ciencia política, bien fundamentada, bien organizada y sistematizada en el mundo, son las disparidades que hay en cuanto a la inversión en investigación, porque si observamos países como Japón, Corea, Estados Unidos, tienen altos, muy altos porcentajes de inversión tanto pública como privada, y seguimos estando con muy escasa inversión en América Latina, en algunas áreas de Asia y obviamente en África, en el continente africano. De tal manera que habrá muchas preguntas que ustedes quisieran plantear a Julian. La Internacional, porque es muy estricta en los tiempos, nos ha ordenado que aprovechemos los días de hoy, de mañana, para acercarnos con Julian y hacer algún intercambio de reflexiones con él, de plantearle algunos cuestionamientos, porque el tiempo se nos fue. Decía yo con afortunadamente la intervención tan amplia de nuestro presidente de la República, y llegó la hora del almuerzo. Entonces, por favor, si hay preguntas, que se las puedan hacer llegar por escrito a Julian, o si gustan acercarse a él en la hora del almuerzo, en otros momentos que haya durante el desarrollo de esta conferencia, pues le pedimos que esté en la mejor disposición a Julian y lo felicitamos por su exposición. Muchas gracias. Gracias. Buenas tardes. Gracias, Julian.
Bien, es así como termina esta primera sesión plenaria, agradeciéndole a Julian Garritman de Alemania su presencia y también a nuestro secretario general del CENTE en México, maestro Alfonso Cepeda Salas, por su intervención. Les informamos que el horario del almuerzo está previsto de las 13:30, que es a este momento, a las 2:30 de la tarde. El almuerzo lo podrán tomar aquí en la sala de frescos, que está del lado derecho a ustedes, casi atrás de de todo el sistema de audio de esta conferencia, y la segunda sesión plenaria iniciará a las 2:55 de la tarde. 2:55 de la tarde, nuestra segunda sesión plenaria se titula Por la pública, los sindicatos tomando la delantera en todo el mundo. Quien moderará esta segunda plenaria será David Edwards, secretario general de la Internacional de la Educación, y participarán como ponentes Agustín Carlo Menoni de Uruguay, Abdelaziz Saibet Dime de Marruecos y Annette Dolan de Irlanda. Así es que a todos buen provecho y nos estaremos viendo a las 2:55 de la tarde para iniciar con nuestra segunda sesión plenaria. Buen provecho. Muchas gracias nuevamente al maestro Alfonso Cepeda Salas y a nuestro ponente Julián Garritman de Alemania.
Con gran dolor, hasta destrozar esta cosa.